Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the iron gates of a Victorian asylum, where the boundary between treatment and imprisonment blurred into something far more complex than history books usually admit. You can almost hear the heavy keys jangling at the attendant's belt as the massive door swings shut behind you, the echo bouncing off whitewashed walls that have absorbed decades of whispers, screams, and silent prayers. The year is 1885 and you've just entered a world where a woman's tendency to read too many novels might land her in the same ward as someone experiencing genuine psychosis, where the smell of carbolic soap mingles with boiled cabbage, and where the most terrifying thing isn't the treatments themselves, but the arbitrary nature of who receives them. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your great-great-grandmother disappeared from family photographs after 1889, or why certain branches of your family tree suddenly go quiet in the historical record. The Victorians built these institutions with such confidence, such architectural grandeur, believing they were pioneering humane treatment for the mentally ill. Yet what actually happened inside these sprawling complexes tells a far more complicated story, one where genuine medical innovation existed alongside devastating abuses, where some patients found unexpected sanctuary while others experienced living nightmares. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're tucked into bed in Toronto or listening during a late shift in Singapore. Maybe you've got your own family stories about ancestors who vanished into institutions. Or perhaps you're simply curious about this strange chapter of medical history that shaped how we think about mental health today. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You stand in the entrance hall of Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North London, one of the largest mental institutions in Victorian England. The building stretches for nearly a third of a mile in either direction, housing over 2,000 patients at its peak. Your eyes adjust to the dim gaslight filtering through high windows, and you notice how the architecture itself seems designed to make you feel small, insignificant, manageable. The superintendent's office door stands to your left, ornately carved oak that whispers of authority and permanence. To your right, a long corridor disappears into shadow, punctuated by doors, so many doors, each one locked, each one containing human stories that the outside world has chosen to forget. The attendant who admitted you wears a severe grey uniform, her face neither kind nor cruel, just professionally blank in that way people develop when their job involves managing human suffering on an industrial scale. She doesn't explain where you're being taken or why. The assumption is that you've already lost the right to such explanations, that the very fact of your presence here proves something fundamental about your inability to understand your own situation. It's this casual erasure of personhood that you'll come to recognize as the asylum's most pervasive feature. More universal than any specific treatment or routine, the Victorian Asylum emerged from genuinely progressive impulses, which makes its failures all the more haunting. Before these institutions, people experiencing mental illness faced brutal conditions in workhouses, prisons, or chains in their family's attic. The asylum movement promised something revolutionary: specialized care, medical treatment, the possibility of cure. Reformers like John Connolly championed moral management, rejecting the chains and violence of earlier eras in favor of kindness, occupation, and structured environments. In theory, these were hospitals, not prisons. In practice, you're about to discover how theories collide with the messy realities of underfunding, overcrowding, and Victorian society's profound discomfort with any deviation from the rigid social norms. You're led deeper into the building, your footsteps echoing on stone floors worn smooth by thousands of shuffling feet before yours. Through a doorway, you glimpse a day room where perhaps 40 women sit on wooden benches, some staring at nothing, others engaged in needlework or quiet conversation. A few turn to look as you pass, their eyes holding that peculiar mixture of curiosity and resignation. You'll soon recognize the look of people who've learned that new arrivals eventually become old-timers, that this place has gravity that few escape. One woman catches your gaze and offers a slight smile, a tiny gesture of solidarity that momentarily pierces the institutional atmosphere. Then she's gone, the door closing as you're guided onward. The asylum operates on a fundamental contradiction that nobody in authority seems willing to acknowledge. It's simultaneously a hospital meant to cure you and a prison designed to contain you until you demonstrate sufficient sanity to rejoin society. But how do you prove sanity in an environment specifically constructed to identify and catalogue every deviation from normality? How do you stay sane when the asylum's own rules and restrictions might drive a perfectly rational person to distraction? Historians still argue whether the Victorian asylum system represented progress or simply a more sophisticated form of social control, a way for families to discard inconvenient relatives and for society to hide away anyone who didn't fit its increasingly rigid definitions of proper behaviour. Your processing continues in a small room where a nurse conducts a cursory physical examination, noting your general health, any visible injuries or marks, the condition of your clothing. She records these observations in a massive ledger, your life reduced to a few lines of bureaucratic description. Later, you'll be photographed, a relatively new technology in the 1880s, your image captured for the medical record, your expression frozen in that moment of transition between your old life and this new existence. These photographs, thousands of them preserved in archives, show faces ranging from defiant, terrified to utterly blank, each one a portal into a human experience we can barely imagine from our comfortable distance. The reality is that you might be here for any of countless reasons, some medical, many social. Perhaps you're genuinely struggling with what we'd now recognise as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression. Or perhaps you're a woman who refused an arranged marriage, expressed too much sexual desire, or simply became inconvenient to a husband who wanted to remarry. You might be here because poverty and malnutrition damaged your mental health, because childbirth left you with postpartum psychosis in an era that had no name for it, or because you were epileptic at a time when seizures were considered a form of insanity. The Victorian Asylum held them all, making no real distinction between illness and inconvenience, between those who needed help and those whose families simply wanted them gone. As you're finally led to your ward, passing through another locked door and then another, you begin to understand that this building is designed as a series of nested containments, each one reducing your connection to the outside world, each one making the possibility of leaving feel more remote. The corridor you're walking through stretches impossibly long, and you realize this sensation isn't accidental. The architects who designed Victorian asylums understood that space itself could be therapeutic or oppressive, depending on how you wielded it. These weren't merely buildings, they were three-dimensional manifestations of Victorian theories about madness, morality, and social order, constructed in brick and stone and iron to reform minds through environmental control. The ceilings tower above you, perhaps 15 feet high, creating an impression of cathedral-like vastness that simultaneously inspires awe and makes you feel crushingly small. Every architectural choice carries intention, though whether that intention serves your healing or your containment remains deliberately ambiguous. Most Victorian asylums followed variations of the corridor plan, a design philosophy that organised patients into wings radiating from a central administrative core. You're currently in one of these spokes, and if you could see the building from above, You'd notice how it resembles a giant comb or a series of fingers reaching across the landscape. This layout served multiple purposes. It separated different classes of patients, allowed for gradual progression through wards as you improved, and made it easy for a small staff to monitor many people. The superintendent could theoretically stand in the central hub and see down multiple corridors simultaneously, a panopticon effect that meant you never quite knew when you were being observed. Historians still argue whether this architectural surveillance represented enlightened observation of patient behavior or simply a more sophisticated prison design dressed in medical language. The walls around you are painted in institutional colors, pale green or cream, or that particular shade of institutional beige that seems designed to avoid offending anyone while simultaneously draining the space of any personality. High windows let in natural light, another supposedly therapeutic feature. But they're positioned well above your head, too high to see out of properly, too high to reach. This is not an oversight. The Victorian Asylum wanted you to experience light and air, fresh air, being considered almost magically curative, but not to gaze at the world you've left behind. The windows open from the top, operated by long poles kept locked away, ensuring ventilation without providing any means of escape. You're meant to exist in a strange liminal state, technically in the world, but not of it. Visible to the sky, but unable to see the horizon. The doors you pass are solid oak, each fitted with a small observation panel at eye level, usually covered by a metal slide that can be opened from the outside but never from within. Some doors have additional features padding on the interior, double locks, peepholes positioned at multiple heights so attendants of different statures can observe. These are the rooms for refractory patients, those who resist the asylum's routines or display behavior deemed disruptive. The padding isn't the soft, cushioned material you might imagine. It's typically made of canvas or leather stretched over the walls, designed more to prevent patients from injuring themselves on hard surfaces than to provide comfort. You catch glimpses through open doors, narrow rooms containing only a mattress on the floor, a bucket, sometimes nothing at all. These are the architectural manifestations of control at its most absolute. Spaces designed to contain without any pretense of therapy. The day rooms represent the asylum's more optimistic face. Large communal spaces where patients spend most of their waking hours. You enter one now, and it's surprisingly spacious, with rows of wooden benches arranged in rigid lines facing the same direction, like church pews or school desks. The psychology is clear. Even relaxation should be organized, structured, observed. Large windows dominate one wall, finally at a height where you can see out to the asylum's ground, manicured lawns, paths for walking, perhaps a cricket pitch or garden plots in the distance. The view is carefully curated to be pleasant but not exciting, pastoral but contained, a sanitized version of nature that won't overstimulate fragile minds. The day room's furniture tells its own story about how the Victorians conceived of asylum life. Everything is heavy, built to last generations, impossible to move without significant effort. The benches are attached to the floor. The tables, if there are any, are massive oak affairs that 6 strong men would struggle to lift. This isn't just about durability in a high-use environment. It's about preventing patients from rearranging their world, from creating any space that hasn't been approved by authority. You can sit where you're told to sit, gather where you're permitted to gather, but you cannot create your own small territories of autonomy. Even the gaslight fixtures are recessed into protective cages high on the walls, placed where no patient could possibly reach them, eliminating any risk of fire or self-harm, but also any control over your own illumination. Some asylums incorporated chapels, elaborately designed spaces that reveal the Victorian fusion of religion and psychiatry. The chapel you might visit on Sundays sits at the heart of the building, its windows featuring stained glass depicting biblical scenes of healing Jesus curing the possessed, casting out demons, restoring sight to the blind. The message is unmistakable. Madness is a spiritual affliction as much as a medical one, and prayer forms part of the therapeutic regime. The pews are arranged so that male and female patients sit separately, of course, supervised by attendants who monitor not just your behavior but your apparent engagement with the service. Are you singing the hymns? Does your face show appropriate devotion? Even your relationship with God becomes subject to institutional surveillance and assessment. The asylum's grounds extend for acres, surrounded by high walls that appear almost decorative from a distance, softened by climbing ivy and flowering shrubs, but reveal their prison-like solidity up close. Walking the grounds represents a privilege, something earned through good behavior and cooperation, withdrawn as punishment for infractions. The paths wind through carefully landscaped gardens where patients perform horticultural labor as part of their treatment, digging and planting and weeding under supervision. There's a cricket pitch where the improving male patients play organised matches on summer afternoons, watched by attendants who simultaneously serve as umpires and guards. The Victorians genuinely believed in the therapeutic value of fresh air and exercise, but they couldn't quite separate therapy from surveillance. Help from control, administrative spaces occupy the front of the building, closest to the main entrance, the most architecturally impressive areas with their carved wood panelling, ornate plasterwork, and furniture that wouldn't look out of place in a gentleman's club. The superintendent's office contains leather chairs, mahogany desks, shelves of medical texts, framed certificates proclaiming professional credentials. This is where families meet with doctors to discuss your case, where committal papers are signed, where decisions about your fate unfold in an atmosphere of learned authority. You'll rarely, if ever, enter these spaces. They exist in a parallel universe to the wards where you live, a reminder that the asylum contains two completely different experiences depending on which side of the locked door you occupy. The basement holds the asylum's practical infrastructure kitchens, producing meals for thousands, laundries processing endless tons of institutional linens, storage rooms, workshops where patients perform labour as part of their treatment. These spaces are perpetually dim, lit by small windows at ground level that admit minimal daylight, ventilated by primitive systems that struggle against the accumulated heat and moisture of industrial-scale cooking and washing. Working in the kitchens or laundries represents both occupation considered therapeutic and punishment. It's hard, hot, monotonous labour. Another example of how the asylum blurs categories until you can't quite determine whether you're being helped or exploited. Some buildings feature airing courts, outdoor spaces enclosed by high walls, where patients can take exercise without accessing the broader grounds. These feel like outdoor rooms, open to the sky but contained on all sides, offering fresh air without freedom. You might pace the perimeter for your allotted hour, perhaps 40 feet by 60 feet, walking the same circuit over and over until you've memorized every brick, every crack in the paving stones, every weed growing through the mortar. The woman sitting next to you in the day room whispers her story during a moment when the attendant's attention drifts elsewhere, and what she tells you shatters any remaining illusions about why people end up here. Her name is Eleanor, and she was committed by her husband after she objected to his business partner visiting their home at inappropriate hours, after she questioned expenses that didn't quite add up, after she became what he called hysterical about matters that weren't her concern. A doctor examined her for 15 minutes, noted her agitated state. Of course she was agitated. 2 men were conspiring to lock her away and signed the certificates. That was 18 months ago, and her husband has since stopped visiting, stopped answering her letters, effectively erased her from his life while she remains trapped here. Her sanity questioned because she dared to question him. Eleanor's story isn't unusual. It's practically a template. Victorian asylums overflow with women whose primary symptoms were inconvenience, independence, or sexuality that made their families uncomfortable. You meet Margaret, committed after giving birth to her fifth child when she experienced what we'd now recognise as severe postpartum depression, but what her husband simply called not being herself. You encounter Sarah, whose nymphomania, the actual diagnosis in her record, consisted of expressing sexual desire for her husband more frequently than Victorian propriety deemed appropriate. There's Catherine, committed by her father when she refused an engagement to a man 30 years her senior. Her resistance to this arranged marriage interpreted as evidence of an unsound mind. The asylum functions as a pressure valve for Victorian society, absorbing women who don't perform femininity according to its rigid scripts. The reasons for commitment range from the tragically legitimate to the absurdly trivial, and the troubling part is that they're all processed through the same bureaucratic machinery with the same professional detachment. You're here because you experience genuine psychosis that makes it impossible to care for yourself, or you're here because you read too many novels and developed overstimulated ideas about women's rights. You're here because epileptic seizures were considered a form of insanity, or you're here because you refused to wear the corset your mother insisted upon and your defiance was labelled hysteria. The Victorian Asylum makes no meaningful distinction between illness and rebellion, between mental health crisis and social nonconformity, between those who need medical care and those who need liberation from oppressive circumstances. Economic factors play a role that nobody wants to acknowledge openly. The middle class and wealthy families can afford private asylums, smaller institutions with better staff ratios, more comfortable accommodations, where nervous disorders get treated with rest cures and sea air. But you're in a county asylum, funded by rates and taxes, where the poor and working class end up alongside those middle-class individuals whose families want them gone but can't afford private care. You meet women who are essentially homeless, whose madness consisted primarily of poverty and nowhere to go, swept off the streets by police who needed somewhere to put them. You encounter men whose shell shock from industrial accidents left them unable to work, whose families couldn't support an additional non-earning mouth, who were deposited here because Victorian society had no other social safety net. The elderly appear in surprising numbers, people experiencing what we'd now recognise as dementia, but what the Victorians simply classified as senile insanity. Their families, struggling to cope with relatives who no longer recognise them, who wander off and get lost, who require constant supervision, make the agonising decision to commit them. There's Thomas, a former shopkeeper now in his 70s, who keeps asking for his wife dead these past 5 years, whose children visit monthly with increasing sadness in their eyes. There's Anna, who once ran a boarding house but now can't remember her own name, whose daughter sobs through visits before departing with visible relief that someone else handles the daily burden of care. The asylum becomes elder care by default in a society that has no other institutional options. Alcoholism sends thousands through these gates, though whether its cause or symptom remains debated. Historians still argue whether Victorian doctors truly believed alcohol dependence was a form of insanity, or whether this diagnosis provided a convenient way to address a social problem through medical institutions. You meet men whose drinking destroyed their families and livelihoods, who experienced delirium tremens, hallucinations, violent outbursts that terrified everyone around them. You also meet men whose drinking probably stemmed from undiagnosed depression or trauma, who are self-medicating conditions that Victorian medicine didn't recognise or understand, whose alcoholism was symptom rather than disease, but who receive the same diagnosis. The same locked wards, the same removal from society. The epileptic patients occupy their own strange category. People experiencing a neurological condition that the Victorians couldn't quite classify, but definitely considered a form of insanity. Seizures were frightening to witness, seemed to involve loss of rational control, and Victorian medicine lumped them together with mental illness, despite occasional voices arguing this made no sense. You watch James, a young man who has grand mal seizures every few weeks, spending the intervening time perfectly lucid, perfectly capable, yet locked away because his condition carries stigma that prevents employment, prevents marriage, prevents any normal life. His greatest fear isn't the seizures themselves, but the gradual institutionalization, the way asylum life erodes his sense of self until he starts to forget what normal existence feels like. Syphilis in its tertiary stage sends people here with legitimate neurological damage. Personalities changed beyond recognition, experiencing psychosis and physical deterioration that Victorian medicine can observe but cannot cure. These patients occupy wards where the smell of decay hangs heavy despite the carbolic soap, where screams puncture the night, where death comes as a relief after months or years of progressive deterioration. The attendants discuss these cases in hushed tones. The moral judgment barely concealed, this is what happens to those who violate sexual propriety. Divine punishment manifesting as medical reality. Nobody mentions the wives infected by unfaithful husbands, the innocent victims of someone else's transgression, locked away to die because their illness embarrasses their families. Political dissidents occasionally find themselves here, though this happens more subtly than you might expect. There are no formal political prisoners in Victorian England officially, but there's William, whose vocal socialism and organising activities led to a diagnosis of moral insanity after he disrupted one too many factory owners' operations. There's Rebecca, whose work with suffragettes brought her to official attention, whose forceful personality and refusal to defer to male authority somehow became evidence of mental instability. The asylum provides a convenient solution for authorities uncomfortable with direct political persecution. Simply reclassify dissent as derangement, and the problem resolves itself behind locked doors and medical certificates. Children appear too, which might be the most disturbing reality you encounter. Some are genuinely profoundly disabled, born with conditions that Victorian families have no resources to manage at home, no educational or care options available. But others are simply unwanted, illegitimate children whose mothers couldn't keep them, orphans with behavioural problems nobody wants to address, boys and girls whose learning disabilities or deafness or simple high spirits got interpreted as mental deficiency. They grow up in the asylum, institutionalised from childhood, shaped entirely by this environment, until they literally cannot imagine life outside these walls. You see them in separate wards, small faces already learning that institutional expression of blank compliance. And your heart breaks for childhood stolen by a society that valued conformity over compassion. The admission process itself reveals how arbitrary these classifications can be. 2 magistrates or a judge plus medical certificates from 2 doctors, that's all it takes to lock someone away indefinitely. The medical examinations are cursory, often conducted in circumstances designed to make anyone seem unstable. The journey that brought you here began days or weeks ago, though the exact timeline blurs in your memory. Trauma and confusion compressing events into a nightmarish sequence that doesn't quite follow normal logic. Perhaps it started with a family conversation that turned into an argument, your voice rising as you tried to explain something that made perfect sense to you but that they kept misinterpreting, twisting into evidence of your deteriorating condition. Perhaps it began with a visit from your family doctor, summoned by worried relatives, who asked you strange questions while watching your reactions with unsettling intensity. Or perhaps there was no warning at all, just men arriving at your door with legal documents, a carriage waiting outside. Your protest dismissed as further proof of the very instability they claimed justified your removal. The legal machinery moves with terrifying efficiency once set in motion. Under the Lunacy Act, the process requires surprisingly little 2 medical certificates and a magistrate's order, or in some cases, Just one doctor's statement if the situation is deemed urgent. The doctors who examine you might spend 15 minutes in your presence. Might ask a handful of questions designed to trap rather than understand. Might arrive with minds already made up based on what your family has told them. You try to remain calm during the examination, knowing that composure might save you, but this very attempt at rationality can be reinterpreted as cunning, as the manipulative behaviour of someone trying to conceal their true condition. The game is rigged from the start, and you're playing against judges who hold all the cards and make all the rules. The medical certificate documents your symptoms in language that sounds authoritative, but reveals troubling subjectivity upon closer examination. Delusions of persecution, one doctor writes, because you insisted your husband was plotting against you even though he demonstrably was, even though the plot succeeded in getting you committed. Excessive excitability and incoherence of thought, notes another, describing your entirely rational anger at being manhandled by strangers and dragged from your home. Refusal to recognize the necessity of treatment, a third observes, as if accepting your own committal should be considered evidence of sanity rather than surrender. The certificates create a narrative that transforms your reasonable responses to an unreasonable situation into symptoms, that pathologizes resistance and labels self-advocacy as lack of insight into your condition. The journey itself often happens in specialized transport. Vehicles that look like ordinary carriages from the outside but contain modifications inside reinforced doors. Windows that don't open, sometimes even restraints built into the seats. You sit between attendants, burly men or stern women whose job is to deliver you safely to the asylum, regardless of your cooperation. If you struggle, if you scream, if you try to appeal to passers-by for help, these actions simply get recorded as additional evidence of your disturbed state. The attendants remain professionally neutral, neither cruel nor kind, occasionally offering reassurances that everything will be fine, that the asylum will help you, that resistance only makes things harder. They've transported hundreds before you, and their detachment suggests they've learned not to engage emotionally with cargo that considers itself wrongly imprisoned. The paperwork that accompanies you contains your entire history, reduced to bureaucratic categories: name, age, marital status, occupation, religion, the basic identifiers. Then the medical information, previous illnesses, current symptoms, behaviours that prompted committal, family history of insanity real or invented, habits regarding alcohol and temperance. There's a section on your supposed dangerousness to yourself or others, a checkbox system that determines which ward you'll initially occupy. Another section documents property and financial arrangements. Because the asylum needs to know who's paying and whether you have assets that might fund your care, or, in some cases, become vulnerable to mismanagement while you're incapacitated. This document will follow you through your entire asylum career, accumulating notes and observations, becoming the official story of your madness that overwrites whatever truth you try to tell. You arrive at the asylum gates during daylight or darkness depending on timing and distance, and this first glimpse of the building from outside imprints itself permanently in your memory. The architecture is designed to impress, to convey institutional authority and permanence, to make clear that this is a place where society exercises power over those it deems unable to exercise power over themselves. The gates themselves are iron, ornate but unmistakably secure, operated by a porter who checks documentation before admitting the carriage. You pass through, and the gates close behind you with an audible clang that seems to echo in your chest. The building looms ahead, brick and stone and countless windows, far too large to comprehend as a single structure, spreading in both directions until it disappears around corners or behind trees. The receiving room where you're first processed feels deliberately impersonal, a space designed to strip away your previous identity and begin the process of institutional transformation. An attendant inventories your possessions, clothing, jewellery, money, personal items, recording everything in a ledger while you watch your life reduced to a list. Historians still argue whether this property protection was primarily about safeguarding patient belongings or about removing anything that might help you maintain a sense of individual identity. Your nice clothes are taken away and replaced with asylum wear. Shapeless garments in coarse fabric that erase class distinctions and mark you as institution property. If you're female, your hair might be cut short for hygiene purposes, another assault on feminine identity in an era when a woman's hair carried enormous social significance. The medical examination that follows is more thorough than the cursory assessment that got you committed, though not necessarily more sympathetic. A doctor, usually male regardless of your gender, though female nurses might assist with female patients, conducts a physical examination checking for signs of disease, injury, or physical causes of mental symptoms. You're measured, weighed, your reflexes tested, your body scrutinized for marks or scars or anything notable. The doctor asks questions about your history, your symptoms, your family. But you've learned by now that honest answers can be twisted into evidence against you. If you're too forthcoming, you're grandiose or lacking judgment. If you're reserved, you're secretive or withdrawn. If you answer confidently, you're exhibiting lack of insight. If you express uncertainty, you're confused or deteriorating. The doctor makes notes in your permanent record, establishing the baseline against which all future assessments will be measured. These initial observations carry enormous weight, creating a narrative framework that subsequent doctors will reference and reinforce rather than challenge. If this first examination describes you as melancholic, future observers will see melancholy even when you feel fine. If it notes a tendency toward excitement, any display of positive emotion becomes evidence of ongoing instability. The record becomes reality. The map replaces the territory, and you discover that medical documentation possesses a kind of institutional magic that transforms subjective impressions into objective facts simply by writing them in the proper ledger with the proper authority. Photography, still relatively novel in the 1880s, adds another layer to your processing. You sit for the portrait photograph. Though this isn't about capturing your personality, it's about documentation, identification, the creation of a visual record that will be attached to your file. The photographer positions your head in a metal frame to keep you still during the long exposure, and you must remain motionless while light slowly burns your image onto a glass plate. Your expression freezes. Whatever emotion you felt in that moment preserved forever fear, defiance, resignation, confusion, anger, or that peculiar blank effect that trauma sometimes produces. These photographs, thousands of them preserved in archives, haunt modern viewers with their directness. These faces staring across a century and a half asking to be seen as human beings rather than cases. The bell that wakes you rings at 6 o'clock each morning with a harsh clanging that seems designed to startle rather than gently rouse, and you learn quickly that the asylum runs on a schedule so rigid that even minor deviations feel like transgressions against natural law. You rise from your narrow iron bed, the mattress thin, the blanket's scratchy wool that never quite provides enough warmth, and join the shuffling line of women moving toward the washroom. Everyone silent because talking isn't permitted yet. Everyone moving with that peculiar institutional gait that develops when you've learned that rushing attracts attention and attention usually brings trouble. The washroom contains rows of basins with cold water, a few precious bars of harsh soap shared among dozens, and you have perhaps 10 minutes to wash your face and hands before the next bell summons you to the next phase of the daily routine. Dressing happens communally, privacy being another casualty of institutional life, and you pull on the same shapeless dress you wore yesterday and will wear tomorrow, the same rough stockings, the same heavy shoes that never quite fit properly, because they're distributed based on approximate size rather than individual need. An attendant watches to ensure everyone completes this task efficiently. Her presence a constant reminder that even the most intimate activities happen under surveillance. Some women need help dressing those too elderly or confused or physically impaired, and you watch as attendants assist with varying degrees of patience. Some gentle, others irritably rough. The quality of care depending entirely on individual temperament, since no formal standards govern how attendants should treat the people in their charge. The first inspection of the day happens before breakfast. Everyone standing beside their beds while the night attendant walks through checking that you've made your bed properly, corners tucked just so, blankets smooth, that you're dressed appropriately, that nothing seems amiss. She's looking for signs of deterioration, evidences of self-harm, contraband items that shouldn't be in the ward, anything that might require reporting to the doctor. This inspection also serves a disciplinary function. Those whose beds don't pass scrutiny might lose some minor privilege, might find themselves assigned extra work duties, might simply receive a sharp verbal reprimand that colours the entire day. You learn to make your bed exactly the way the attendant prefers, learning her particular standards through trial and error because they're never explicitly stated. Breakfast arrives at 7 o'clock, served in the day room with everyone seated on those fixed wooden benches, eating from tin plates with tin spoons because any better implements might become weapons or tools for escape. The food is institutional in the worst sense porridge, so bland it seems designed to offend no one while satisfying no one. Bread that's heavy and tough, tea so weak it barely colours the water, occasionally a bit of butter or dripping if you're lucky. The portions are calculated to provide adequate nutrition without waste or luxury. Every meal a reminder that you're being maintained rather than nurtured. Historians still argue whether the uniformly terrible food in Victorian asylums reflected budget constraints or represented a deliberate feature of moral management. The idea that plain food prevented overstimulation and encouraged mental tranquility. Eating happens in near silence. Conversations permitted but discouraged. The atmosphere more like a prison mess hall than a hospital dining room. You notice hierarchies emerging even here. Certain women get slightly better portions. Seats near the inadequate heating. Small favours from attendants who've developed preferences among their charges. These distinctions aren't based on medical need but on behavioural compliance. On who best performs the role of grateful. Improving patient versus who resists or complains or simply irritates the staff. The asylum claims to treat everyone equally, but you discover that equality in institutional settings somehow always develops exceptions for those who make staff lives easier. After breakfast comes the morning work assignment, because the Victorians firmly believed that occupation was therapeutic, that idle hands invited madness to flourish, that structured labour would retrain disordered minds into productive patterns. The reality is that the asylum requires enormous amounts of labour to function, and patients provide free workers, but this economic exploitation gets wrapped in therapeutic language that makes it seem like the work benefits you rather than the institution. You might be assigned to the laundry, spending hours in hot, humid conditions washing and wringing endless sheets and towels in the clothing of 2,000 people, your hands becoming raw from constant exposure to harsh soap and water. Or perhaps you're sent to the sewing room, mending torn garments, making new asylum wear, embroidering linens, work that's considered suitably feminine and calming though your eyes ache from the close work in inadequate light. Male patients face different work assignments: gardening, farming the asylum's grounds, maintaining buildings, sometimes skilled labour if they possess trades before admission. You watch through windows as men work in the gardens, digging and planting under supervision, their labour producing vegetables that supplement the asylum's food supplies while supposedly providing them therapeutic contact with nature and wholesome exhaustion. The best workers receive small privileges, Perhaps tobacco rations or slightly better food. Incentives that turn occupation into a behaviour modification system where compliance brings rewards and resistance brings consequences. For those deemed too disturbed for useful work, they're simply sitting hours upon hours of enforced idleness in the day room, staring at walls or fellow patients or nothing at all, time stretching into an endless present tense where nothing happens and nothing changes. This might actually be worse than the hard labour. At least work provides distraction, marks time's passage, offers the satisfaction of tasks completed. Sitting offers only your own thoughts, which in an asylum environment tend toward despair, anxiety about your situation, rumination on the events that brought you here, spiralling concerns about how long you'll remain trapped in this place. Some women develop a particular vacant stare, eyes open but focused on nothing, a psychological escape from unbearable awareness of their circumstances. The midday meal arrives at noon, similarly bland and institutional boiled meat or fish, potatoes, perhaps some cabbage, bread, more weak tea. The portions are marginally larger than breakfast, but no more appetizing, and you eat because your body needs fuel, not because the food provides any pleasure. Doctors occasionally inspect during meals, walking through the day room observing eating behaviours, noting who eats too much or too little or displays abnormal food preferences. Everything becoming data points in the endless surveillance that characterises asylum life. You learn to eat normally, to show neither excessive appetite nor poor appetite, to avoid attracting clinical attention by being too anything. Afternoons might bring outdoor exercise if weather permits and your behaviour warrants. Walking in circles around the airing court or, if you're privileged, access to the larger grounds. Fresh air is considered therapeutically essential, and even difficult patients get some outdoor time, though perhaps in smaller, more secure yards under closer supervision. You walk and walk, movement for its own sake, and initially you resist the pointlessness of pacing the same paths repeatedly, but eventually you come to crave these outdoor hours, the sky above you, the wind on your face, these small reminders that a world beyond walls continues to exist. The superintendent occupies a position of nearly absolute authority within the asylum's walls, a medical monarch whose decisions shape every aspect of institutional life. And you quickly learn that his personality, his competence, his fundamental beliefs about madness and treatment determine whether this place functions as hospital or warehouse, therapeutic community or prison. Dr. Morrison, the current superintendent at your asylum, is a man in his 50s with elaborate side whiskers and an air of professional confidence that borders on arrogance, who makes his rounds each morning accompanied by a retinue of junior doctors, nurses and attendants, a medical procession moving through the wards, while patients stand beside their beds or workstations to be observed like specimens in a clinical exhibition. He might stop to ask you a question, to examine your appearance, to inquire about your state of mind. But these interactions feel less like conversations than interrogations where your every word gets weighed for evidence of improvement or continued instability. The superintendent's power extends beyond medical decisions into every aspect of asylum administration hiring and firing staff, setting institutional policies, managing the budget, determining which experimental treatments to adopt, even designing the daily schedule and diet. Some superintendents are genuine reformers who fight for better conditions and innovative treatments despite budget constraints and public indifference. Others are essentially custodial managers focused on maintaining order and avoiding scandal. Content to warehouse patients as efficiently as possible while publishing occasional papers about their supposedly advanced methods. Dr. Morrison falls somewhere in between. A competent administrator who believes sincerely in moral management but who also believes that discipline and structure matter more than individual patient preferences or complaints. He's not cruel, but he's not particularly compassionate either, viewing patients as cases requiring management rather than people deserving partnership in their own treatment. The medical officers beneath the superintendent are young doctors gaining experience in asylum work, positions that attract those interested in the emerging specialty of psychiatry, though it's not yet called that, and those who simply need employment while establishing their practices. They conduct daily rounds, record observations in patient files, prescribe medications or treatments, respond to emergencies, but they do so under the superintendent's oversight and according to his philosophy. You notice how these younger doctors sometimes show more empathy, occasionally advocate for individual patients, suggest alternative approaches, but they're constrained by hierarchy and the knowledge that disagreeing too forcefully with the superintendent might cost them their positions. Historians still argue whether the Victorian asylum's rigid medical hierarchy promoted consistency of care or simply protected incompetent superintendents from accountability while silencing potentially innovative younger voices. The matron controls the female side of the asylum with authority parallel to the superintendent's in everything except ultimate medical decision-making, and misses. Blackwood is a formidable woman whose inspection you've learned to dread more than the doctor's rounds because she notices everything: a button fastened incorrectly, a corner of your bed not quite straight, a moment of whispered conversation during quiet hours. She came up through the ranks, starting as an attendant decades ago, and her experience makes her devastatingly effective at detecting any deviation from routine, any hint of conspiracy or resistance, any behavioral changes that might signal deterioration or improvement. Unlike the doctors who visit briefly and move on, the matron inhabits the wards constantly, her presence a permanent feature of your environment, and her approval or disapproval carries enormous practical consequences for your daily comfort and treatment. The attendants represent the asylum's real power structure, the people who control your moment-to-moment existence far more than any doctor or medical theory. Martha, who works your ward most days, is a thick-shouldered woman in her 40s whose expression suggests she's seen too much to be surprised by anything, who can be almost kind when she's in good spirits, but whose bad days bring sharp words and rougher handling of those under her care. She earns perhaps £30 a year, working 12-hour shifts with one day off weekly, living in staff quarters that aren't much better than patient wards, and the job attracts women from working-class backgrounds who need employment more than they need any particular calling to care work. Some attendants are genuinely dedicated, treating patients with respect and advocating for their needs despite poor pay and difficult conditions. Others view it as just a job, doing the minimum required while counting hours until shifts end. And some, most troublingly, seem to enjoy the power asymmetry, using their authority to punish perceived slights or simply to relieve the tedium through casual cruelty. Male attendants on the men's wards face even more challenging conditions. Responsible for patients who might become physically violent, who might require forcible restraint, who might resist medications or treatments with strength that demands multiple staff members to overcome. The job attracts former soldiers, labourers, men accustomed to physical confrontation, and while many are perfectly professional, the selection process doesn't screen for empathy or therapeutic skill. You hear stories from male patients during the rare moments when gender-segregated sections interact during chapel services or special events, stories of attendants who rule their wards through fear, who settle disputes with their fists, who apply restraints unnecessarily or keep them on longer than required simply because a patient annoyed them. These abuses happen in a shadow economy of violence that superintendents can choose to investigate or ignore. And most choose ignorance because maintaining full staffing matters more than addressing individual complaints from patients whose credibility is already questioned by virtue of their presence here. The night staff operates with even less supervision. Skeleton crews watching over hundreds of sleeping patients. And the overnight hours are when the asylum's most vulnerable moments occur. Night attendants make rounds, checking that everyone remains in bed, that no one has self-harmed, that all the locks remain secure. But the darkness and reduced staffing create opportunities for both kindness and abuse that never appear in official records. Some night attendants show unexpected gentleness to patients struggling with insomnia or nightmares, sitting quietly with them, offering reassurance, treating them as fellow humans during hours when no supervisor watches. Others use the darkness for exploitation, sexual abuse that leaves no witnesses, thefts of patient property, or simply neglect when patients call out needing help that never comes. Nurses occupy an ambiguous position in the hierarchy, trained in basic medical skills but subordinate to doctors while superior to attendants. Their roles still being defined during this period when nursing itself is professionalizing. The nurses on your ward change with shifts, some barely distinguishable from attendants in their duties, others clearly possessing medical knowledge that attendants lack, able to recognize symptoms and make clinical observations that inform treatment decisions. Sister Agnes, who supervises the infirmary, represents nursing at its most professional, competent, organized, demanding high standards from her staff while showing genuine concern for patient welfare. But she's the exception. Most asylum nurses receive minimal training and work under conditions that prevent them from exercising much clinical judgment. The asylum also employs chaplains, teachers for those patients capable of benefiting from education, workshop supervisors who oversee occupational therapy activities, clerks who maintain the endless paperwork, and groundskeepers who maintain the physical plant. Each occupies a specific niche in the institutional ecosystem, and each develops particular relationships with patients depending on their role. The chaplain might be the only staff member who speaks with you about topics beyond symptoms and behavior, though his spiritual counsel often carries implicit judgment about sin and redemption. The workshop supervisor might show appreciation for your skilled needlework, offering rare praise in an environment where positive feedback is scarce. These peripheral staff members sometimes provide the most human interactions you experience, precisely because they're not primarily invested in diagnosis and treatment, not constantly assessing your mental state. Able to relate to you around specific activities or topics rather than through the lens of your supposed pathology. The morning you're told you'll begin moral therapy, you feel a flutter of hope despite everything you've learned about maintaining low expectations in this place, because the term itself sounds humane, progressive. Nothing like the restraints and isolation you've witnessed in the refractory wards. Moral therapy, or moral management, or moral treatment depending on who's explaining it, represents the Victorian Asylum's most optimistic face. The belief that mental illness can be addressed through environmental influence, kindness, routine, and engagement rather than through punishment or physical intervention. The philosophy emerged from Quaker reformers earlier in the century, from places like the York Retreat, where restraints were abandoned in favour of treating patients as rational beings temporarily experiencing disturbance, rather than as dangerous animals requiring chains and cages. Your moral therapy begins with increased freedom of movement within certain boundaries. Permission to access the better day rooms, where books line shelves and writing materials are available, where windows overlook gardens rather than bare courtyards, where the atmosphere feels marginally less institutional. The books are carefully selected, nothing too stimulating, nothing that might inflame passions or introduce disturbing ideas, mostly religious texts, improving literature, natural history volumes with plates of birds and flowers. You're encouraged to read, to engage your mind in wholesome direction, though an attendant occasionally checks what you've selected to ensure it's appropriate. Historians still argue whether this literary curation represented therapeutic caution about overstimulation or simply Victorian censorship extending into medical practice, controlling what ideas patients could access under guise of protecting fragile minds. Writing letters becomes part of your routine, sitting at a small desk with paper and pen provided, composing careful messages to family members or friends who might advocate for your release. The therapeutic theory suggests that maintaining connections to the outside world, practicing reasoned communication, demonstrating through written words your capacity for rational thought will all contribute to your improvement and eventual discharge. But there's a catch you discover quickly. Every letter you write passes through the superintendent's office for review before being posted. Letters deemed too emotional, too critical of the asylum, containing complaints about treatment or claims of wrongful committal, simply disappear, never reaching their intended recipients. You learn to write bland, reassuring messages expressing gratitude for the excellent care you're receiving, discussing the weather and your daily activities in cheerful tones, anything that might pass the censorship that dare not speak its name. The cruel irony is that this enforced dishonesty, this performance of contentment you don't feel, gets interpreted as evidence of your improving judgment and insight. Occupational activities expand beyond mere labour into pursuits considered genuinely therapeutic gardening in designated plots, where you can choose what flowers to plant, at least from approved options, creating something beautiful rather than just productive. You spend mornings working soil that's surprisingly therapeutic to touch, planting bulbs and seeds, watering and weeding, watching things grow in an environment where so little else changes. The garden becomes a space of relative autonomy, where your choices matter, even if only in small ways, where you can create beauty and see the results of your efforts blooming by the pathway. Other patients work nearby, and the shared activity sometimes permits conversations that wouldn't happen in the more supervised day room. Whispered exchanges about life before, about hopes for release, about the small rebellions that keep your sense of self alive. Music and art appear in the better-funded programs. A piano in one day room where those with skill can play approved selections during designated hours. Supervised art sessions where you draw or paint under the guidance of a visiting teacher who volunteers her time. The music especially provides moments of transcendence, sounds that connect to emotion and memory in ways that bypass the asylum's constant intellectual monitoring. You listen to Martha, another patient, playing Beethoven with surprising skill, her fingers remembering what her mind sometimes forgets. And for those few minutes, the room transforms from institutional space into something approaching the cultural venues you knew before committal. The therapeutic value is real. These activities remind you that you're more than your diagnosis, that capacities for beauty and skill and aesthetic pleasure survive even here. Social activities organised under moral therapy include dances held monthly in the Great Hall, carefully chaperoned events where male and female patients mingle under watchful eyes, where a small band of patient musicians provides waltzes and reels, where for one evening the asylum pretends to be something other than what it is. You wear a better dress retrieved from storage, your hair carefully arranged by a kind attendant, and you stand along the wall watching couples dance with varying degrees of grace, some moving naturally, others shuffling awkwardly after months or years of institutional life have eroded their social skills. When someone asks you to dance, permission must be obtained from the watching attendant. First, you rediscover the pleasure of music and movement and human contact that isn't clinical or custodial. These dances serve therapeutic and social control functions simultaneously. They reward good behavior, provide incentive for compliance, offer relief from routine while also demonstrating who gets included and who remains locked in their wards, excluded from privileges as punishment or precaution. Cricket matches and other outdoor sports occupy the male patients during summer months. Carefully organised competitions between wards that generate genuine enthusiasm and rivalry. Men running and bowling and batting under supervision that tries to balance safety concerns with the therapeutic value of vigorous exercise and friendly competition. The asylum's cricket pitch rivals some village greens in quality, meticulously maintained by patient labour, hosting matches that attract spectators from staff and allowed patients. These events create moments of normalcy, of life beyond treatment, where men can be athletes and teammates rather than cases and symptoms, where skill and effort matter more than diagnosis. Excursions beyond the asylum walls represent the pinnacle of moral therapy privileges. Carefully supervised trips to local churches, parks, or cultural sites for patients deemed sufficiently recovered and trustworthy. You join one such outing after months of exemplary behaviour. Walking in a group accompanied by attendants to a nearby village for a church service. The outside world shocking in its normalcy after asylum life. The village people stare at your group with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, recognizing the asylum party, keeping their distance, and you're reminded that even this freedom carries the stigma of your institutional status. But the sky above is unrestricted. The horizon extends to actual distance rather than ending at walls. Shops display goods you haven't seen in months, and ordinary people move freely about their business. The excursion provides both hope this world still exists. You might rejoin it someday and despair it continues without you. You've been erased from it. You don't quite fit anymore after institutional life has changed you. The day they take Margaret to the treatment room, you hear her screaming from 3 corridors away. The sound cutting through the asylum's usual ambient noise of shuffling feet and murmured conversations and distant bells like a knife through fabric. And you understand with sickening clarity that moral therapy represents only one face of Victorian psychiatry, while other, darker methods operate simultaneously behind doors that patients pray never to pass through. The screaming stops abruptly after several minutes, replaced by silence somehow more disturbing than the noise, and when Margaret returns to the ward hours later she's soaked, shivering, her lips blue, her eyes vacant with shock, and nobody needs to ask what treatment she received because everyone already knows the cold bath. Hydrotherapy taken to extremes. Immersion in water so frigid it shocks the system into a kind of submission that doctors interpret as therapeutic benefit. The cold bath exists in multiple variations, each with its own supposed therapeutic rationale, each capable of causing genuine suffering under the guise of medical intervention. The simple version involves immersion in cold water for extended periods, sometimes hours, the theory being that the shock redirects blood flow, calms excitement, reduces fever of the brain that Victorians believed caused certain forms of madness. You watch attendants prepare the bath, filling a deep tub with water and ice, and you see the terror in patients' eyes when they're selected for this treatment, the way they beg and resist before being physically forced into the water, held there by strong hands on their shoulders while they gasp and shake and plead for mercy that comes only when the prescribed time elapses. Doctors observe these sessions with clinical detachment, timing the immersion, noting physical responses, recording observations about whether the patient emerges calmer or merely exhausted into numbness. The continuous bath represents a variation considered more humane, tepid rather than cold water. Patients left for days or even weeks in special tubs with canvas covers that restrain movement while supposedly providing gentle, constant hydrotherapy. You see these patients when attendants change the water or assist with bodily functions, their skin wrinkled and pale, their eyes dulled by the monotony of endless immersion, and you wonder how this differs from torture, except in intention and medical justification. Historians still argue whether hydrotherapy provided any genuine therapeutic benefit, or whether its primary function was behavioral control, a treatment whose unpleasantness discouraged the behaviors that prompted its prescription. Punishment masquerading as medicine. Restraint takes forms both mechanical and pharmaceutical, and the asylum maintains a disturbing array of devices designed to limit patient movement and agency. The straitjacket remains the most recognized. Heavy canvas garments with long sleeves that cross over the chest and buckle behind. Immobilizing arms while allowing the patient to remain mobile otherwise. walking the corridors wrapped in these restrictive cocoons, unable to touch or gesture or embrace or harm. You see Thomas wearing one for days after an outburst, the canvas darkening with sweat and grime, his expression moving from anger to resignation to a kind of defeated acceptance that's more disturbing than his initial resistance. The straitjacket gets prescribed for violence or self-harm risk, but also for persistent masturbation, for patients who tear their clothing, for those who simply won't stop moving or talking or engaging in behaviours that irritate staff. Mechanical restraints multiply beyond straitjackets, leather cuffs that attach wrists to bed frames, ankle shackles, full-body restraints that spread-eagle patients on beds where they must soil themselves because movement to use chamber pots is impossible. The muff, a device that looks deceptively innocent, restrains hands inside a padded cylinder, preventing fine motor control while appearing less harsh than cuffs or straitjackets. Wristlocks connect patients' hands together or to fixtures, allowing limited movement while preventing the reaching and grasping that might disrupt wards or threaten staff. Each device comes with official policies about appropriate use, duration limits, required documentation, but you discover that policies and practice diverge significantly, that restraints applied temporarily might remain for days or weeks, that documentation gets falsified or ignored when convenient. Seclusion isolation in locked rooms with minimal furnishing and no human contact functions as both treatment and punishment. The distinction between these categories deliberately blurred in Victorian asylum practice. You know the seclusion rooms exist in a separate section of the building, small cells with padding or bare walls, spaces designed to contain patients deemed too dangerous or disruptive for the regular wards. Time in seclusion stretches strangely, without clocks or windows or human voices to mark its passage. Your only interactions the slide of a food tray through a slot in the door 3 times daily, the occasional observation by an attendant peering through the small window. Patients emerge from extended seclusion changed, some genuinely calmer, others broken in ways that make them compliant without addressing underlying issues. Still others made worse by isolation that amplified their distress rather than relieving it. Pharmaceutical interventions rely on a limited arsenal of drugs, whose mechanisms nobody truly understands but whose effects are deemed therapeutically useful. Opium and its derivatives provide sedation for excited or violent patients, calming mania and agitation, while also creating dependence that doctors don't fully recognize as problematic. Laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol appears in treatment records with alarming frequency, prescribed for everything from sleeplessness to pain to hysteria, its addictive properties discovered gradually through the very patients being dosed repeatedly. Bromides, metallic salts that depress nervous system function, get administered to epileptic patients and those with excited states. Their side effects including skin eruptions, mental dulling, and a peculiar shuffling gait that marks chronic bromide users as distinctly as any institutional uniform. Chloral hydrate enters the pharmaceutical arsenal in the 1870s, a new sedative hypnotic that doctors embrace enthusiastically despite limited understanding of its dangers, prescribing it for insomnia and agitation in doses that sometimes prove fatal when combined with other medications or given to patients with weak hearts. You watch patients shuffle through days in medicated hazes, their eyes unfocused, their responses delayed, their personalities flattened by chemicals intended to make them manageable rather than well. The line between therapeutic sedation and chemical restraint disappears entirely in practice, with medications prescribed as much to ease staff burden as to benefit patients, though the medical records carefully frame everything in therapeutic language that obscures these practical motivations. Purging and bleeding persist from earlier medical eras despite growing evidence of their uselessness. Victorian doctors reluctant to abandon traditional methods that at least provide the illusion of active intervention. You see patients weakened by repeated purgatives, their bodies depleted by laxatives and emetics administered to balance humours or redirect morbid processes. 19th century language describing 18th century theories that refuse to die despite mounting evidence against them. The classification system that determines which ward you occupy, which patients surround you, which privileges you might access feels simultaneously precise and arbitrary. A bureaucratic sorting mechanism that reduces complex human conditions to categories that serve institutional management more than therapeutic benefit. You arrive labelled as a recent acute case, meaning your symptoms appeared relatively suddenly and committal followed quickly, placing you in a ward reserved for patients considered potentially curable. Those whose madness hasn't yet become chronic, whose prospects for eventual discharge remain reasonably hopeful. The ward occupies a middle tier of the asylum's hierarchy, not the best accommodations reserved for wealthy private patients, but far better than the chronic wards where hope has been administratively abandoned and custodial care replaces any pretense of treatment. Gender segregation represents the asylum's most absolute division, male and female patients occupying separate wings of the building, using different entrances, exercising in different yards, maintaining separation so complete that you might spend years here without ever speaking to a male patient, except during carefully supervised chapel services or special events. The Victorians considered this separation essential for maintaining moral propriety and preventing the sexual complications they believed would inevitably arise from mixing mentally unstable men and women. The female side feels different from what you hear about the male wards, quieter perhaps, less overtly violent though no less filled with suffering. Staffed entirely by women from attendants up to the female superintendent who reports to the asylum's overall medical superintendent, but maintains day-to-day autonomy over her domain. Within the female wards, further subdivisions separate acute from chronic cases, and you learn to read the progression of institutional decline by observing which direction patients move. The acute wards maintain relative optimism. Treatments here aim toward cure. Routines include more activities and privileges. Conversation focuses on improvement and eventual discharge. But patients who remain symptomatic after months or years gradually migrate toward the chronic wards, spaces where routine replaces treatment, where the daily schedule exists more to structure time than to promote healing, where staff speak about management rather than recovery. The chronic wards smell different, look different, feel different, more crowded, less maintained, populated by women whose institutional stays have stretched from months to decades, whose families stopped visiting years ago, who've become permanent residents of a place that calls itself a hospital but functions increasingly like a warehouse. Class distinctions persist even within diagnosis-based classifications, because Victorian society couldn't imagine mental illness erasing social hierarchy, even temporarily. The private patient wards offer accommodations that barely resemble the pauper sections, private or semi-private rooms rather than dormitories. Better furniture, superior food, access to personal possessions and clothing from home, more staff attention and therapeutic engagement. These patients pay substantial fees, often pounds per week, and receive treatment that looks more like rest cures at expensive sanitariums than asylum care. You occasionally glimpse them during your work assignments, well-dressed women walking manicured paths with private attendants, their madness apparently more genteel than the pauper variety, though you suspect the primary difference lies in their ability to pay rather than any meaningful distinction in symptoms or suffering. The idiots, and imbeciles Victorian terminology for those with intellectual disabilities, occupy separate wards, segregated from the mentally ill despite both populations residing in the same institution. These classifications reflect Victorian beliefs that mental deficiency differs fundamentally from mental illness, that intellectual disability is permanent and inherent, while madness might be cured. The two populations require different management approaches. You see these patients during your movements through the asylum. Children and adults who were born with developmental disabilities or acquired them through injury or illness, many capable of more than the institution credits them with, but trapped in wards that provide minimal education or stimulation. Some have been here since childhood, institutionalized by families unable to care for them, growing up knowing nothing except asylum life, their potential forever stunted by an environment that manages rather than develops. The troublesome or refractory wards contain patients deemed difficult, violent, resistant to routine, persistently attempting escape, sexually inappropriate, or simply annoying to staff in ways that exhaust patients. These backwards exist in the asylum's less visible spaces, areas visitors don't tour, where conditions deteriorate because oversight decreases as geographical and administrative distance from the superintendent's office increases. The patients here experience more restraint, more seclusion, harsher treatment, attended by staff members often selected for physical strength rather than therapeutic skill. You hear stories whispered about the back wards, about patients kept in isolation for months, about attendants who rule through fear and violence, about the women who disappear into these spaces and emerge months later, broken or never emerge at all, dying in obscurity, buried in the asylum cemetery with only a number marking their grave. Epileptic patients occupy ambiguous status, sometimes classified as insane because seizures suggested brain disease, sometimes segregated into their own wards because their condition seemed distinct from mental illness proper. Historians still argue whether this segregation protected epileptic patients from being mistreated as mad or further stigmatized them by association with asylums, whether placement in these institutions provided necessary supervision during an era when anti-epileptic medications barely existed, or simply warehoused people whose condition frightened families and employers. You meet Hannah in the epileptic ward, a young woman whose grand mal seizures occur weekly, but who spends the intervening days perfectly lucid, working in the laundry, helping care for more impaired patients, living a half-life where her intelligence and capability remain constrained by a diagnosis that makes her unemployable and unmarriageable in Victorian society. The suicidal designation determines ward placement and supervision level regardless of your underlying diagnosis. Patients considered self-harm risks requiring constant observation and restricted access to anything that might facilitate death. You're assigned briefly to this classification after an incident reaching for a shard of broken crockery. Nothing more, but enough to trigger institutional paranoia about your intentions. The suicidal ward means sleeping in a dormitory where a night attendant maintains vigil with a lamp, where you use chamber pots under direct observation, where meals are served with wooden spoons that can't be sharpened or concealed, where every interaction is filtered through the assumption that you're seeking opportunities for self-destruction. The classification becomes self-fulfilling in some cases, the loss of even minimal privacy and autonomy driving patients toward the very despair that supposedly justified these restrictions in the first place. Improving patients move toward discharge wards, transitional spaces where routines more closely approximate normal life, where you're given small responsibilities and increased freedoms to test your readiness for release. The bread arrives at your place on the bench 3 times daily, the same dense, heavy loaf that tastes of nothing much except sustenance reduced to its most basic form. And you learn to eat it because your body needs fuel even when your spirit has lost interest in the mechanical process of chewing and swallowing. The asylum feeds approximately 2,000 people on a budget calculated in pennies per person per day. And this economic reality shapes every meal into exercises in institutional efficiency, where nutrition matters but flavour, variety, and pleasure are luxuries the ratepayers won't fund. Breakfast is porridge oatmeal cooked in massive quantities until it achieves a consistency somewhere between liquid and solid, served lukewarm because the trip from kitchen to ward takes long enough for heat to dissipate, accompanied by that bread and weak tea sweetened minimally with sugar that's carefully rationed to prevent waste or hoarding. The midday dinner represents the main meal, arriving around noon with a predictability that might comfort you if the food itself weren't so relentlessly monotonous. Boiled beef appears twice weekly, tough cuts from animals past their productive prime, cooked until any remaining flavour has leached into the surrounding water, served in portions carefully weighed to provide adequate protein without excess. Mutton comes on alternate days, similarly overcooked, similarly tough, the meat often requiring more chewing than your jaw wants to invest. Fish, usually cod or other cheap varieties, appears on Fridays, a concession to Catholic dietary requirements that extends to all patients regardless of religion. The fish boiled until it flakes into dry, tasteless shreds that you wash down with water because no sauce or butter accompanies it. Potatoes feature in every meal, boiled in their jackets, served plain. The starch that fills bellies cheaply and prevents anyone from claiming the asylum starves its patients. Technically true even as it provides minimal pleasure or variety. Vegetables appear when seasonal and cheap cabbage most commonly. Boiled until all texture disappears and any nutritional value has largely evaporated. Its distinctive sulphurous smell permeating the dining hall and lingering in corridors afterward. Turnips, carrots when available, occasionally onions, all boiled into submission. All served without seasoning beyond minimal salt. The asylum maintains gardens where patient labour produces some of these vegetables, but you notice that the best produce somehow finds its way to the superintendent's table in the staff dining room, while patients receive what remains the smaller potatoes, the outer cabbage leaves, the carrots with imperfections that make them unsuitable for more discriminating consumers. Historians still argue whether the uniformly terrible food in Victorian asylums reflected purely economic constraints, or whether dietary austerity was considered therapeutically beneficial. The belief that plain food prevented overstimulation and promoted mental tranquility, justifying meals that barely rose above survival level. Tea accompanies every meal, though calling it tea feels generous when the liquid in your tin cup is so weak you can barely detect the tea leaves' contribution. More coloured water than actual beverage, sweetened with a half teaspoon of sugar that dissolves into imperceptibility. Coffee never appears too stimulating, too expensive, considered potentially dangerous for disordered minds. Milk is reserved for the sick wards and children, appearing occasionally in your tea if you're recovering from illness, but otherwise absent from your diet. The beverages arrive lukewarm regardless of season. The kitchen's distance from the wards and the serving process ensuring that hot drinks cool and cold drinks warm to an unappetizing middle temperature that suggests institutional convenience matters more than the sensory experience of those being served. Supper, served around 6 o'clock, mirrors breakfast with perhaps minor variations, more bread. Occasionally cheese in tiny portions, more weak tea, sometimes a thin gruel or soup that's mostly water with vegetable scraps floating in it, providing liquid and minimal nutrition while using up kitchen waste that might otherwise go to pigs. The portions are calculated to prevent hunger without inducing fullness, maintaining patients at a level of perpetual slight dissatisfaction that becomes so constant you stop noticing it. The background hum of insufficient plenty that characterizes institutional feeding. Better behaved patients or those with influential families occasionally receive supplemental rations, an extra slice of bread, a bit of butter, a piece of fruit when available, these small luxuries functioning as both genuine nutrition and behavioural incentives, rewards that cost the asylum pennies but feel like treasures when your palate has forgotten what real flavour tastes like. The clothing you wear feels like its own form of containment, shapeless garments in coarse fabrics that erase individual style and mark you unmistakably as asylum property. Institutional wear designed for durability and economy rather than comfort or dignity. The dress you've been issued standard female patient attire is made of rough cotton or linen in a dull grey or brown that won't show dirt readily, cut in a style that might have been fashionable 30 years ago, but now simply reads as institutional, with none of the bustles or elaborate trim that characterised women's clothing in the 1880s. The fit is approximate at best, distributed based on your general size category rather than actual measurements, so the shoulders don't quite align with yours, the waist sits too high or too low, the hem drags on one side where the garment's generic length doesn't match your specific height. Undergarments are similarly institutional shift and drawers in unbleached cotton. Stockings that bag at the ankles because they're not quite the right size. No corset because stays with their boning and laces are considered potential weapons or tools for self-harm. This absence of proper foundation garments leaves you feeling oddly exposed and unsupported, your body moving differently without the familiar structure that Victorian women's clothing typically provided. And you realise how much of feminine identity was literally constructed through the garments that shaped and contained female bodies. Shoes are heavy, practical things with thick soles and minimal shaping, distributed from a common store where you found the pair that fit best from limited options, breaking them in over painful weeks because new asylum shoes are stiff and unforgiving, designed to last years of constant wear rather than to provide immediate comfort. Your own clothing, what you wore when you arrived, was taken away during admission processing and now sits in storage somewhere, labelled with your name and admission number. Theoretically available for your discharge but practically inaccessible during your stay. Some patients from wealthy families receive parcels of clothing from home, small luxuries that ease institutional life, a better dress for chapel, a warm shawl for outdoor exercise, proper shoes that actually fit, but these items require superintendent approval and careful monitoring to ensure they don't contain contraband or materials that might facilitate escape. You watch as Mary receives such a parcel, her face lighting with pleasure as she unfolds a dress in actual blue, a colour that isn't institutional grey or brown, and you feel the unfairness of class distinctions extending even into madness, even into this place that theoretically treats all patients according to medical need, rather than social status. The piano music drifting from the recreation hall catches you by surprise one Thursday afternoon, actual Mozart rather than hymns, played with enough skill that for a moment you forget where you are and simply listen to beauty manifesting in this unlikely place. Recreation represents the asylum's acknowledgement that humans require more than food and shelter and medical treatment to remain human, that even disordered minds need joy and connection and activities that serve no purpose beyond pleasure itself. The monthly dances you've heard about from longer-term patients sound almost mythical evenings when the great hall transforms with decorations, when the band assembled from musically talented patients plays waltzes and polkas, when men and women dress in their best available clothing and dance under the watchful eyes of attendants who maintain propriety, while allowing this carefully controlled mingling of the sexes. You experience your first dance after 3 months of exemplary behaviour, your name appearing on the approved list posted in the day room, and the anticipation builds for days beforehand. Women discussing what they'll wear, whether certain men might ask them to dance. How wonderful it will be to hear music and move and feel momentarily normal. An attendant helps you dress in a better frock retrieved from storage, something donated by a charitable organisation. Not fashionable, but clean and whole and blue rather than institutional grey. Your hair is arranged more carefully than usual, pinned up in a style that approximates respectability, and when you look in the small mirror permitted for this occasion, you almost recognise the woman staring back, not quite the person you were before committal, but closer than the institutional ghost you've become. The Great Hall glows with gaslight and decorations made by patients during craft sessions, paper chains, folded flowers, attempts at festivity within budgetary constraints that permit no actual luxury. The band sits on a small platform. 5 men with various instruments who've been practicing for weeks, their music somewhat rough but earnest. And when they begin the first waltz, something shifts in the room's atmosphere. The institutional space briefly becoming something else entirely. Men line one wall, women the other. Attendants stationed at intervals watching for any impropriety. And you stand among the women feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified of the social interaction you've half forgotten how to navigate. Do you remember which topics are safe in conversation? Can you smile naturally rather than with the guarded expression asylum life teaches, will anyone actually want to dance with you? Or will you spend the evening against the wall watching others find moments of connection you're excluded from? A man approaches supervised by an attendant who must approve his request before you can accept and asks if you'd care to dance. His voice nervous, his eyes kind despite the institutional dullness that affects you all. You accept, your hand finding his shoulder while a hand rests carefully, appropriately on your waist. And suddenly you're moving to music, turning and stepping in patterns your body remembers even when your mind struggles with the simplest tasks. The contact feels almost shocking after months of only clinical or custodial touch. This hand on your waist attached to a person rather than a function. This moment of connection that exists for its own sake rather than serving institutional purposes. You dance 2 numbers before the attendant signals that you should change partners, that too much familiarity between patients must be prevented, and you're passed to another man, then another, each brief partnership a small gift of human contact and normalcy. Between dances, you attempt conversation, the social skills rusty but not entirely lost. He tells you he was a clerk before his committal, that he hopes to be discharged soon, that his sister still visits monthly. You share less have learned that revealing too much invites complications, that every word spoken to fellow patients might somehow reach staff ears and inform their assessments of your condition. But you smile, you listen, you exist briefly as a social being rather than a case number, and when the evening ends and everyone returns to their separate wards, you carry the memory like a treasure. Something that proves you're still capable of joy despite everything this place has taken from you. Cricket matches on the male side provide similar moments of normalcy, wrapped in institutional supervision. Men playing with surprising skill on a pitch that rivals village greens, watched by patients and staff who cheer and groan at plays good and bad. You observe from a distance during an outdoor exercise period, watching men run and bowl and bat, their bodies remembering athleticism even when their minds struggle with reality, and you feel envy for this outlet, this permission for vigorous physical expression that female patients rarely receive. Women's exercise means sedate walks, perhaps croquet if your behaviour warrants access to equipment. Gentle activities considered appropriate for delicate feminine constitutions even in madness. Historians still argue whether these gendered distinctions in recreation reflected genuine beliefs about appropriate activities, or simply extended Victorian society's general restrictions on female physical expression into the asylum setting. The library, such as it is, provides refuge for those permitted access, a room lined with donated books selected for moral and therapeutic appropriateness. Nothing too exciting or disturbing or intellectually challenging. You find comfort in novels by Sir Walter Scott, in nature writing that describes landscapes you can't visit, in religious texts that occasionally offer genuine solace despite their moralizing tone. Reading provides escape. Hours when your mind can travel beyond these walls, even while your body remains contained. And you ration this pleasure carefully because too much reading draws suspicion is your escape into books, a healthy diversion or evidence of withdrawal from reality. You learn to read in moderation, to demonstrate engagement with asylum life rather than retreating too far into literature. Balancing the solace books provide against the institutional preference for patients who remain present and observable rather than lost in imaginary worlds. Needlework occupies countless hours, considered particularly appropriate for female patients, the delicate work supposedly calming for agitated minds while producing useful items for the asylum or charitable causes. You sit with a dozen other women in the sewing room, embroidering pillowcases and tablecloths under supervision, the repetitive motions genuinely soothing despite the obligation rather than choice that brings you here. Some women possess remarkable skill, their stitches tiny and perfect, creating beauty and margins society no longer permits them to occupy. You watch Elizabeth creating elaborate floral patterns, her fingers swift and sure with needle and thread, and wonder what she might have accomplished in a life not interrupted by committal. What talents asylum life simultaneously preserves and wastes. The letter that arrives bearing your sister's handwriting sends your heart racing with hope and dread in equal measure. Because correspondence from the outside world carries power to comfort or devastate depending on its contents. A connection to the life you've lost that reminds you simultaneously that such life continues and that you're excluded from it. You're summoned to the matron's office where she hands you the already opened envelope. Privacy being another casualty of institutional life. Every letter scrutinized before reaching your hands, and you unfold the single sheet with trembling fingers, scanning quickly for the emotional temperature before reading properly. Your sister writes cheerfully about mundane matters, the weather, her children's progress in school, household concerns that once interested you but now feel alien, descriptions of a world that continues its rhythms without you. And buried in the third paragraph comes the information you've been desperate for. She's spoken with the superintendent. She believes you're improving. She hopes you'll be home soon. But the hopefulness feels forced. The reassurance is hollow. And you read between the lines to detect what she's not saying, that the family has grown accustomed to your absence. That your return would complicate household arrangements that have settled into new patterns without you. That soon is a word without specific meaning that might stretch into months or years. She doesn't mention your husband, which means either he's forbidden her to write or he's taken no interest in your situation, effectively abandoned you to institutional care, while he continues life unburdened by a wife whose behaviour embarrassed him. The letter concludes with love and the promise to visit when circumstances permit. This vague timeline suggesting visits won't come frequently, that you shouldn't count on regular contact, that you're being gently relegated to a category of family members who exist in memory and obligation, but not in daily consideration. You're permitted to write a response. Sitting at a small desk under the matron's observation, composing careful sentences that express gratitude for her letter. Reassure her about your improving health. Describe asylum life in terms that emphasize therapeutic activities while omitting anything that might alarm, or that might be interpreted by censoring eyes as complaint. You want to write the truth that you don't belong here, that the treatment sometimes feels like punishment, that you're losing yourself to institutional routine, that you need her to advocate more forcefully for your release. But such honesty would ensure your letter never reaches her, would mark you as lacking insight into your condition, would extend your stay rather than shorten it. So you write the acceptable lies, the performance of grateful patient making steady progress under excellent care, and you seal the envelope knowing that this censored version of yourself is all your sister will see. All the outside world will know of your experience. Visits, when they occur, take place in a designated room under direct supervision, an attendant present throughout to monitor conversation for anything inappropriate or concerning, and you've learned that these supervised encounters bear little resemblance to normal family interactions. Your sister arrives on a Sunday afternoon, dressed in her visiting clothes, her face showing that particular expression of forced cheerfulness people adopt when entering asylums. Determined to remain positive despite the institutional grimness that surrounds her. You embrace briefly physical affection limited because too much emotion draws attention and then sit across from each other at a small table while the attendant positions herself nearby, close enough to hear everything, her presence ensuring that neither of you can speak freely. The conversation that unfolds feels like a performance for the attendant's benefit. Both of you play in roles of concerned sister and improving patient, avoiding topics that matter in favour of safe banalities that reveal nothing, risk nothing, accomplish nothing except fulfilling the obligation of the visit. You want to tell her what you've witnessed. The woman kept in isolation for weeks. The treatments that seem designed to break rather than heal. The arbitrary nature of decisions that shape your fate. But the attendant's presence silences these truths, and instead you discuss the weather, the garden plots you're tending, the book you've been reading, anything innocuous enough to pass institutional scrutiny. Your sister mentions family members who send their regards, though you suspect some have forgotten you entirely, and describes events you've missed, weddings and births and deaths that occurred while you've been locked away from life's normal passages. The visit lasts perhaps 45 minutes before your sister makes apologetic noises about needing to catch her train, about duties at home requiring her attention, and you recognise the relief in her voice, the gratitude that she can leave when this becomes too uncomfortable while you remain behind. She promises to return soon, that word again, meaningless in its vagueness, and to write more frequently. Promises you've learned not to believe too firmly because good intentions collide with the reality that you're out of sight and gradually moving out of mind. You embrace again at parting, and you feel her shoulders relax as she steps away, as the attendant escorts her back toward the entrance and freedom, and you're led back to your ward where the afternoon stretches ahead empty, except for the echo of conversation that revealed nothing and accomplished less. Letters sometimes arrive from unexpected correspondents, former friends, distant relatives, charity volunteers who've taken an interest in asylum patients, and these carry their own complicated emotions. A letter from a friend you haven't seen since before committal fills you with joy until you read its contents and discover she's writing out of duty rather than genuine connection. Her sentence is stiff and formal, avoiding any real intimacy, treating you as someone to be pitied rather than engaged with as an equal. She doesn't suggest visiting, doesn't propose writing regularly. Just this single letter acknowledging your existence before likely returning to a life where you no longer fit. Other letters come from evangelical volunteers who've learned your name from asylum records, religious tracts poorly disguised as personal correspondence, urging you to find salvation and suggesting your mental condition stems from spiritual failings that prayer might correct. These you find almost offensive in their presumption, their reduction of complex human suffering to simple moral failing. The asylum's own correspondence policies create additional barriers between you and the outside world beyond the censorship of outgoing mail. Incoming letters deemed inappropriate, too emotional, too distressing, containing information considered harmful to your recovery simply disappear, never reaching your hands, the superintendent deciding unilaterally what communications you're mentally stable enough to receive. You wonder what letters have been intercepted, what information about your life and family has been withheld because someone else judged you incapable of processing it appropriately. The newspaper that somehow circulates through the ward despite official restrictions carries a story that makes several women cluster around reading over each other's shoulders. An exposé about conditions at another asylum. A journalist who gained admission under false pretenses and documented abuses that mirror too closely what you've witnessed here. The article describes patients chained to walls, beatings by attendants, starvation rations, medical neglect that allowed curable conditions to become fatal. And while you know your own institution doesn't descend quite to these depths, the difference feels like degrees rather than kind. Variations on themes of institutional power wielded without adequate oversight or accountability. The scandal triggers investigations, inquiries, eventually reforms, and you realise that public exposure represents one of the few forces capable of changing asylum practices. That shame accomplishes what humanitarian concern often cannot. The article mentions Nellie Bly. Though perhaps not by that name, you've heard whispers about this American journalist who feigned madness to expose asylum conditions in New York, whose published account shocked readers with descriptions of cold baths, rotted food, violent attendants, and the ease with which a sane woman could be trapped in such institutions. Her work inspired imitators. Journalists in Britain attempting similar undercover investigations. And while asylum superintendents denounce these infiltrations as sensationalist deceptions, you notice that conditions often improve temporarily after exposés, that the threat of public attention modifies behaviour in ways that medical ethics apparently don't. Historians still argue whether these journalistic investigations accurately represented typical asylum conditions or focus selectively on the worst institutions to create more dramatic narratives. But for patients living these realities, the question of representativeness matters less than the question of whether anyone outside these walls cares enough to demand change. The Lunacy Commission conducts its annual inspection, a ritual that sends the asylum into frantic preparation weeks beforehand, attendants cleaning obsessively, staff reviewing records to ensure proper documentation, patients coached on appropriate responses if questioned by inspectors. You watch this performance with cynical amusement, seeing how easily institutional theatre can obscure institutional reality. How inspectors who visit for a few hours annually can be shown a sanitised version that bears limited resemblance to daily life. The day of inspection. The commissioners walk through wards that gleam with unusual cleanliness, observe patients engaged in therapeutic activities carefully arranged for their benefit, review records that document proper procedures and medical oversight, and interview a carefully selected sample of patients unlikely to complain or whose complaints can be dismissed as symptoms of their conditions. You're not selected for interview, which probably means your file contains observations suggesting you might be too critical, too articulate about grievances, too likely to present the institution in unfavourable light. Instead, they speak with Sarah, whose confusion ensures she can't formulate coherent complaints, and with Martha, who's been here so long she's institutionalised past the point of imagining better conditions, and with Elizabeth, whose genuine improvement makes her eager to praise the treatment that supposedly cured her. The Commissioner's report, published months later, notes some minor deficiencies but generally approves the asylum's operations, commends the superintendent for his management, and recommends continued funding. Nothing changes except that the unusual cleanliness gradually fades back to normal institutional grimness, and everyone returns to routines that don't require pretense for external observers. Parliamentary inquiries occur periodically when scandals grow too large to ignore. MPs questioning asylum administrators and medical experts about conditions and treatment philosophies, but these governmental investigations often generate more rhetoric than reform. You hear about testimonies describing moral management and therapeutic optimism, physicians explaining their scientific approaches to mental disease, superintendents defending their institutions against unfair criticism from journalists who don't understand medical complexities. Rarely do patients testify, and when they do, their credibility remains inherently questioned after all. They're mad. Their perceptions presumably distorted by disordered minds, their complaints likely symptoms rather than legitimate grievances, the structural impossibility of patients speaking truth to power, when their very presence in asylums is taken as evidence that their perceptions can't be trusted, means that institutional perspectives dominate official inquiries regardless of what actually happens behind locked doors. Reform movements gained strength gradually through the Victorian period, Organisations like the alleged Lunatics Friend Society, advocating for patients' rights and protections against wrongful committal, demanding legal reforms that would make involuntary institutionalisation more difficult and discharge more accessible. These activists include former patients who've navigated the system successfully enough to regain their liberty and credibility, family members who witnessed loved ones trapped unjustly, physicians who broke ranks with asylum establishment to critique its practices. They publish pamphlets, lobby parliament, take individual cases to court, slowly building pressure for change even as the asylum system continues expanding. More institutions built to house growing populations of people society wants removed from view. The Lunacy Act of 1890 emerges from these reform pressures, introducing additional legal protections around committal procedures and patient rights. Though you discover that laws written with good intentions can be undermined in practice by institutions resistant to change. The new regulations require more formal certification processes, mandate judicial review of committal papers, establish clearer paths for patients to petition for discharge. But these procedural safeguards only matter if patients know about them and can access legal assistance to utilise them, neither of which the asylum system actively facilitates. The law also introduces categories of voluntary patients who can admit themselves and theoretically leave when they choose. Though the boundary between voluntary and involuntary quickly blurs when voluntary patients who request discharge find themselves suddenly reclassified as requiring involuntary detention for their own protection, individual reformers sometimes make surprising differences. A new superintendent arrives with genuinely progressive ideas, transforming institutional culture through force of personality and administrative changes, demonstrating that leadership matters enormously in determining whether an asylum functions primarily as hospital or warehouse. You hear stories from other institutions about superintendents who've abolished restraints entirely, who've opened locked doors, who've implemented work programs that pay patients for their labour rather than simply exploiting it, who've created more home-like environments where recovery becomes imaginable rather than theoretical. But these reformers fight constant battles against budget constraints, public fears about dangerous lunatics, professional colleagues who view their methods as dangerously idealistic, and the momentum of institutional practices that resist change simply because they've always been done that way. Whistleblowers within asylum systems risk their careers to expose abuses, attendants who report colleagues' violence, physicians who document neglect and incompetence, administrators who take complaints seriously rather than suppressing them. These internal critics often face retaliation dismissal, blacklisting, professional ostracism because institutions protect themselves by punishing those who threaten their reputations. The day Mary receives her discharge papers, the entire ward buzzes with excitement and envy in equal measure, because release from the asylum represents the dream that sustains you through endless institutional days, the possibility that this sentence might eventually end, that you might rejoin the world beyond these walls and reclaim some version of the life that was taken from you. Mary has been here 14 months, committed after what doctors called puerperal mania following childbirth, and her gradual improvement has been documented in weekly assessments that tracked her progression through wards, from acute to improving to discharge ready, each move representing a small victory in the larger battle to be declared sane enough for freedom. She shows you the discharge certificate signed by the superintendent, the official declaration that she's recovered sufficiently to resume her place in society, and her joy is tempered by uncertainty about what awaits outside, whether her husband will receive her warmly or resentfully, whether she can successfully mother the child she's been separated from for over a year, whether the stigma of asylum residency will follow her into her supposedly restored life. The path to discharge winds through multiple gates, each requiring different keys held by different authorities, and you've learned that release represents not a single decision, but an accumulation of positive assessments, bureaucratic approvals, and external circumstances aligning favourably. The superintendent must certify your recovery, declaring that symptoms have sufficiently resolved that you no longer require institutional care, that you're unlikely to harm yourself or others, that you've demonstrated capacity for independent functioning. This medical judgment depends heavily on behavioural observations. Have you been compliant, cooperative, appropriately emotional but not excessively so, engaged in activities but not manic about them, thoughtful but not delusional, sad but not dangerously depressed? The narrow path of acceptable presentation requires constant navigation, performing sanity according to institutional definitions, while maintaining enough authentic self that you don't lose track entirely of who you are beneath the performance. Family involvement dramatically affects discharge prospects, because releasing you requires somewhere for you to go and someone willing to accept responsibility for your continued supervision. Patients with families eager to have them back, homes where they'll be welcomed and supported, leave far more readily than those whose families have effectively abandoned them or whose home situations contributed to their committal in the first place. You watch Elizabeth struggle with this reality her symptoms have largely resolved. The superintendent agrees she's recovered, but her husband hasn't visited in 8 months and doesn't respond to letters about discharge arrangements. Without family willing to receive her, she remains trapped despite medical clearance for release. Institutionalized, not by illness but by social abandonment, and you see her improvement gradually eroding as weeks of waiting turn into months with no resolution. Financial considerations shape discharge decisions in ways nobody explicitly acknowledges. Private patients whose families pay substantial fees, sometimes leaving earlier than their conditions might medically warrant, while pauper patients whose care is publicly funded face more stringent recovery standards before discharge. Historians still argue whether this disparity reflects genuinely different treatment outcomes. Perhaps better care for paying patients produces faster recovery, or simply economic incentives that make asylums reluctant to retain expensive private patients, while equally reluctant to discharge public patients whose continued presence justifies institutional funding and staffing levels. You've noticed that private patients rarely remain longer than a year unless genuinely severely ill, while pauper patients stretch into years or decades institutionalized. And while the doctors would explain this through medical differences, the economic patterns suggest other factors operating beneath therapeutic rhetoric. Trial discharge represents an intermediate step for some patients, released into family care with the understanding that readmission can occur quickly if symptoms return or behavior becomes unmanageable. This arrangement provides safety valve for families uncertain about their ability to manage a recovered relative, knowing they can return the person to asylum care if the situation deteriorates. But it also creates precarious freedom for the discharged patient who understands they're on permanent probation, one concerning behaviour away from recommittal. You know people who've been through multiple cycles of discharge and readmission, their lives oscillating between institution and community, never quite stabilising in either location, and you wonder whether this revolving door reflects genuine illness fluctuation or impossible expectations placed on people trying to reintegrate into families and communities that never fully accept them back. Legal appeals represent another potential route to freedom. Patients petitioning courts to review their committal and detention, arguing they're sane and wrongfully held despite medical opinions to the contrary. These appeals require legal assistance that most patients can't access or afford, knowledge of procedures that institutions don't share, and willingness to challenge medical authority in ways that often trigger retaliation or reclassification as more disturbed. You've heard whispered stories about successful appeals, patients freed by judicial orders overriding superintendent decisions, But these cases remain rare enough to be legendary rather than realistic options for most. The few who successfully navigate legal channels often possess resources, education, family support, financial means that most asylum residents lack, making legal release primarily available to those who probably shouldn't have been committed in the first place. Death provides the final release for thousands, patients who enter asylums and never leave except through the mortuary, their bodies buried in institutional cemeteries with markers bearing numbers rather than names, their deaths recorded in registries but rarely mourned beyond perfunctory notices. You've attended asylum funerals, brief services in the chapel before burial in grounds set aside for this purpose, rows of graves where institutional populations find their final rest, and you've learned that dying here means dying largely forgotten. Families often not notified until after burial. Memorial services conducted more as institutional obligation than genuine mourning. The asylum cemetery holds people who are someone's child or parent or sibling, who had lives before these walls, who possessed hopes and dreams and relationships. But their markers provide no hint of these identities, reducing them to admission numbers and death dates that tell no stories beyond institutional record keeping. Some deaths result from conditions that brought people here: tertiary syphilis running its fatal course, epilepsy that couldn't be controlled with Victorian medicine, physical illnesses that mental institutions were poorly equipped to treat. Others stem from institutional conditions themselves, infections spreading through overcrowded wards, tuberculosis thriving in populations weakened by poor nutrition and inadequate fresh air despite theoretical emphasis on its therapeutic value, accidents during treatments or restraint procedures, suicides that supervision failed to prevent. The death registers record causes with clinical precision that obscures questions about whether better funding, better training, better care might have prevented some of these losses. Escape represents the forbidden fantasy, whispered about but rarely attempted because the asylum's architecture and security make successful flight nearly impossible. The building you've lived in for these months or years stands as one member of a vast institutional family that spreads across Victorian Britain, over 100 county asylums by century's end housing more than 100,000 patients. A system that grew from reform impulses into something far more troubling, a network for removing inconvenient people from society, for warehousing those who didn't fit, for managing madness and disability and social deviation through segregation and containment dressed in medical language. You understand now that you've been part of an enormous experiment, the Victorian belief that mental illness could be cured through institutional treatment colliding with the reality that most people committed here never leave, that asylums designed as hospitals gradually transform into permanent residences for populations society wants hidden. The architecture surrounding you will outlast your lifetime. These imposing Victorian structures built to last centuries, and you wonder what future generations will think when they encounter these buildings, whether they'll recognize them as monuments to both humanitarian progress and institutional failure, to medicine's aspirations and society's prejudices operating simultaneously. The legacy of what happened here extends far beyond these walls, shaping how mental illness gets understood and treated for generations after the Victorian asylum's decline. The fundamental tension you've experienced between care and control, treatment and punishment, hospital and prison persists into modern mental health systems that still struggle to balance individual liberty with societal protection, therapeutic intervention with patient autonomy. Historians still argue whether the Victorian asylum represented progress from earlier brutality or simply more sophisticated oppression. Whether its failures stemmed from inadequate resources and understanding or from fundamental philosophical problems with segregating and institutionalizing people experiencing mental health crises. the truth probably contains elements of both. The asylum system emerging from genuinely compassionate impulses that became corrupted by economic constraints, social prejudices, and the tremendous power asymmetries inherent in institutions where some people hold absolute authority over others. The language you've learned here, words like lunatic and asylum and moral management, gradually falls out of favour as the 20th century progresses, replaced by new terminology that attempts to destigmatize mental illness even as many underlying attitudes persist. The massive Victorian institutions slowly empty through deinstitutionalization movements. Patients released into community care that often proves inadequate to support them, trading institutional neglect for a different kind of abandonment on streets and in prisons that become the new asylums for people in mental health crisis. The buildings themselves often survive their original purposes, converted into apartments or office spaces or standing empty. Their long corridors and high ceilings and locked doors repurposed or decaying, physical reminders of when society believed the answer to madness was removal and confinement rather than integration and support. Your own story, whatever its eventual ending, forms one thread in a vast tapestry of human experience largely erased from official histories that prefer to discuss medical theories and administrative policies rather than lived realities of institutionalization. The letters you wrote that were never sent, the conversations that happened under surveillance, the small resistances and accommodations that let you maintain some sense of self despite institutional pressures to conform these leave few traces in historical records that focus on superintendents' reports and government inquiries rather than patient voices. Yet these experiences shaped you profoundly, changed how you understand autonomy and authority, trust and vulnerability, the fragility of the boundary between inclusion and exclusion in societies that claim to value individual liberty while maintaining systems for removing those who challenge norms or prove inconvenient. The question of who really belongs in asylums haunts the institution from its inception. The impossibility of drawing clear boundaries between sanity and insanity, between those who need institutional care and those who need liberation from oppressive circumstances, between medical treatment and social control. You've met people here who genuinely suffer from conditions that impair their ability to function, who benefit from structure and medical supervision, who might have died without institutional care. And you've met people whose primary problem was being female in a society that pathologized female independence, being poor in a society that criminalized poverty, being different in a society that demanded conformity. The asylum contains both populations without really distinguishing between them, applying the same treatments and restrictions to everyone regardless of whether their problems are primarily medical or primarily social. And this fundamental confusion about the institution's purpose guarantees that it will fail many of those it claims to serve. The treatments you've experienced or witnessed, the moral therapy and the cold baths, the occupational work and the restraints, the medications and the isolation represent Victorian medicine grappling with conditions it barely understood, trying methods that range from genuinely helpful to actively harmful while lacking the knowledge to distinguish reliably between them. Modern psychiatry looks back on these practices with a mixture of recognition and horror, seeing both the origins of current therapeutic approaches and the mistakes that resulted from combining limited understanding with tremendous institutional power over vulnerable people. The medications have changed, the therapies evolved, the terminology shifted, but the fundamental challenge remains how to help people experiencing mental health crises without robbing them of dignity, autonomy, and the very humanity that treatment should restore rather than diminish. The stories that emerge from Victorian asylums, when they emerge at all, often come filtered through institutional records created by doctors and administrators rather than patients themselves. Perspectives that favour institutional narratives over individual experiences. The few patient accounts that survive letters, diaries, Memoirs written after release provide crucial counter-narratives that complicate official histories, revealing that patients often understood their situations with clarity that staff denied them credit for, that resistance to institutional authority might represent sanity rather than illness, that recovery sometimes happened despite rather than because of asylum treatment. These voices remind us that medical institutions contain human beings whose perspectives matter, whose experiences deserve documentation and remembrance, whose resistance to dehumanizing treatment represents strength rather than symptom. The Victorian Asylum ultimately fails its stated mission to cure madness and return patients to society. The optimistic rhetoric of moral management colliding with realities of chronic overcrowding, inadequate funding, and the sheer impossibility of what was being attempted, transforming fundamental aspects of human personality and perception through environmental manipulation and behavioral conditioning. But in its failure, it reveals important truths about how societies manage difference and deviance, about the power structures that allow some people to define normality and enforce it through institutional mechanisms, about the precarious nature of liberty when committal requires only medical certificates and a magistrate's signature. The asylum makes visible the usually invisible boundaries that separate those included in society from those excluded, boundaries that shift based on behaviour, identity, circumstances in ways that should trouble anyone who values freedom and questions who gets to define its limits. As you sit in the day room on another endless afternoon, watching light move across walls, marking time's passage in ways more visceral than any clock, you carry knowledge that changes how you understand yourself and society forever. You know now how easily freedom can be lost, how quickly identity can be eroded by institutional life, how much power flows through those who control definitions of sanity and madness. You understand that asylums reveal truths about the societies that build them, their fears, their prejudices, their capacity for both compassion and cruelty, their fundamental confusion about how to balance individual liberty with collective security. And you hold hope, however fragile, that telling these stories matters, that bearing witness to what happens in places society builds to contain its unwanted might somehow contribute to creating better futures where people in crisis receive help that dignifies rather than diminishes, where difference doesn't automatically trigger exclusion, where the power to define normality carries responsibility to question whose interests such definitions really serve. The asylum stands behind you now as a physical and metaphorical space, its architecture solid enough to endure centuries, but its purpose and meaning constantly shifting as new generations interpret its legacy. Some will see these buildings as monuments to medical progress, others as memorials to institutional abuse. And perhaps both perspectives contain truth: the Victorian Asylum, a site of simultaneous healing and harm, care and control, reform and oppression. What matters most is remembering that these walls contained lives, that the categories and treatments and institutional routines affected real people whose humanity persisted despite everything the system did to reduce them to cases and symptoms and numbers in ledgers. Your story, like thousands of others, deserves remembering not as curiosity or cautionary tale, but as testament to human resilience in the face of systems designed to erase individuality, to survival when survival itself represents a kind of victory, to the persistent human capacity for maintaining dignity, even in circumstances specifically designed to strip it away. The light fades in the day room as evening approaches, another day ending much like the one before, the routine continuing its relentless progression through meals and work and sleep and beginning again. But you're still here, still yourself beneath the institutional overlay, still capable of hope despite everything that's happened and everything you've witnessed. The asylum takes many things from those it contains: freedom, certainly, privacy, autonomy, sometimes health and sanity themselves, but It cannot take everything unless you surrender it. So you hold what you can. Remember who you were. Maintain connection to the person you might become again if discharge ever comes. And you survive another day in this strange liminal space between society and its margins. Between past and uncertain future. Between the person you were and whoever you're becoming through this experience. The story continues. Unresolved. Because you're living it still. Because institutional time moves differently than the time outside. Because endings here rarely arrive with the clarity or closure you'd prefer. But you endure, which is its own form of resistance. Its own quiet rebellion against systems that would prefer you simply disappear into categories and forget you were ever anything more. And so the evening settles around you, familiar and strange all at once. The asylum preparing for another night of locked doors and supervised sleep and dreams that carry you briefly beyond these walls before morning bells return you to this persistent reality. You close your eyes and breathe slowly, letting the day drain away, gathering strength for tomorrow's small battles and survivals, for the ongoing work of remaining human in a place that sees you primarily as patient, case, problem to be managed. The Victorian Asylum continues its operations around and through you. This massive system that will outlast your personal involvement in it, and you exist within it while somehow remaining apart, never fully institutional despite everything, holding tight to some essential core that no amount of treatment or routine or time can entirely extinguish. Tomorrow will bring another day much like today, but for now there's only this moment, this breath, this quiet persistence that represents your most fundamental form of resistance, the simple, stubborn insistence on continuing to exist, to feel, to hope, to remain yourself against all odds and obstacles. The asylum tries to contain you, but you remain somehow larger than its categories, deeper than its diagnoses, more complex than its treatments can address. You are not your illness or your committal or your patient number, not the person described in medical records or the case discussed in ward rounds. You're someone with a story that began before these walls and will continue. Somehow, beyond them, a narrative that the institution enters but doesn't define completely. And in this knowledge, in this persistent sense of self that survives institutional pressures, lies the most important truth of all that the Victorian Asylum, for all its power and architecture and authority, cannot finally take what matters most, the essential humanity that makes you who you are, the inner life that remains yours alone, the consciousness that observes and remembers and preserves experience even as the institution tries to reshape it. You're still here. You're still you, and that, in the end, might be the greatest victory possible within these walls. The quiet triumph of survival and persistence that history books rarely acknowledge, but that represents the real story of what happened inside Victorian asylums, not just the treatments and theories and reforms, but the human lives that continued despite everything, the individual selves that endured, the stories that waited to be told when voices finally found the freedom to speak them without institutional censorship or medical reinterpretation. Your story, still unfolding, still yours, still mattering, even here, even now, even when it feels like no one beyond these walls remembers or cares. You remember, you care, you continue, and perhaps that's enough for now. This moment, this breath, this persistence through another asylum evening toward whatever morning might eventually bring. The day room empties slowly as patients shuffle toward their sleeping wards, and you move with them through familiar corridors grown soft in gaslight's gentle glow, your footsteps tracing paths worn smooth by countless journeys before yours. The attendant's voice sounds almost kind tonight. Tired, perhaps, speaking softly as she directs everyone to their beds, and you notice small mercies you might have missed before the blanket folded at the foot of your bed, slightly thicker tonight against autumn's advancing cold, the window that someone opened briefly to admit fresh evening air before closing it against the chill. These tiny gestures of care within the institutional routine remind you that even here, humanity persists in unexpected moments. You settle into your narrow bed and pull the rough blanket close, finding comfort in its weight and warmth despite its scratchy texture. Your body grateful for rest after another long day of navigating asylum life with its endless small negotiations between self and system. Outside the window, stars appear in darkening sky, the same stars visible beyond these walls, connecting you to a larger world that continues its ancient patterns regardless of human institutions and their temporary boundaries. The night attendant makes her rounds, her lamp casting moving shadows that dance across ceiling and walls, and you close your eyes against the light, letting consciousness drift towards sleep's welcome escape. Tomorrow will come soon enough with its bells and routines and small survivals. But tonight there is only this warmth and darkness and the slow breath of women sleeping in around you. All of you suspended together in this strange institutional space. All of you human despite everything that tries to reduce you to less. Your breathing deepens, matching rhythm with the night's quiet pulse, and gradually thought gives way to stillness. Awareness fades toward dreams, and sleep arrives like a gentle friend offering temporary shelter from the waking world, wrapping you in its soft forgetfulness until morning calls you back again. Sweet dreams.